I would like to welcome everyone, whether in person or online. My name is Zsolt Enyedi. I'm the current leader of the Re-Democratization working group at the Democracy Institute. This is one of our group events, and I'm extremely happy to have Jennifer McCoy from Georgia State University as our guest lecturer. Jennifer is I think by now deserves the title of frequent visitor in Budapest. He has been here, and we hope he will be here many times in the future. And he works on a topic that interests many of us, not only here at the Democracy Institute, but also at the Social Science Center of the ex-Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And this is why I welcome also a representative of that institution. So without any further ado, let me give the floor to Jennifer, and let's have half an hour, maybe maximum 40 minutes long talk, and then have an open discussion that will last another half an hour. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you, Zsolt. Well, it's really great to be back in Budapest. It feels very strange to be talking about anything except Ukraine at this moment. But at least this topic is related, particularly as we look at divided societies in deciding how to grapple with a challenge like the invasion of Ukraine, about what to do. So I've been working on this project really for the last 5 years or so. I've been focusing on the rise of political polarization and what I call pernicious polarization, and how it affects democracy, the pernicious consequences for democracy. But now I really want to move to what do we do about it? And so I'm going to talk about some ongoing research today, moving into that. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? What I want to show you is how polarization is growing around the world. And when it does reach pernicious levels, how it's harming democracy. And this is the question. Even when countries depolarize, it's not always sustainable and may not make democracies more resilient. So, today what I want to do is kind of talk about the scope of the problem by showing you the trends, global trends. Very briefly talk about the theory of pernicious polarization and how some of our more recent research on the consequences for democracy, and then how do we overcome it? What are the historical patterns? What are some of our thinking on theorizing what opposition strategies can be? And then I'm going to give you 2 examples with the difficult cases of the United States and Hungary. Okay. So, looking at this graph, what we see is how polarization has been increasing really in every region of the world except Oceania. And I tried to make it clean, so I'm only showing 4 regions here. But particularly since 2005 and then beyond the financial crisis of 2008, we can see that it's increasing, and in all of these regions of the world. If we look at Europe and we break it down by subregions, we get more of an answer about which parts, because not all of Europe is polarizing to the same degree. And what we see is that the lines, the higher levels of polarization, are most clearly in the Balkans, Southern Europe, and East Central Europe. Very low polarization is in Western Europe and the Nordic countries. And if we break that down even further, then looking at Central and Eastern Europe, here are just a few of the countries, but to show you how very high, near the very top of the range, are 3 countries in particular, Hungary, Slovenia, and Poland. And just for comparison, some of the lower ones, the ones who do not have high polarization, are Lithuania, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Now, this is another really interesting contrast. When we look only at the very established, the wealthy, Western liberal democracies, the more established democracies. Then we see an interesting finding here, and that is how exceptional the United States is. The United States stands out as the one established democracy that is above, that is in this top range here of polarization, which I will explain further in a minute. So you see how the United States, this purple line, has really risen since in this century, in the 21st century. It has been growing dramatically. We can also see Australia is fairly high and rising, which is the next one down. And then the others, again, comparing with Western Europe, New Zealand, and Japan as other established democracies. So what is this measure that I've been showing you, that I've been using? This data comes from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, and it's a new variable that they've introduced. So this is an expert survey that asks experts on specific countries to answer a range of questions every year. And this one they have introduced that really reflects what I'm calling pernicious polarization, is really kind of following my concept of polarization. This is the question they ask: to what extent is society divided into mutually antagonistic camps in which political differences affect social relationships beyond political discussions? And the answers range from 0 to 4. So the top of those charts I was showing you, 4, that answer is yes, to a large extent, opposing camps generally interact in a hostile manner. So this, I like using this data because it is a good indicator, because we haven't had any really good indicator of polarization to use in this research. There are all kinds of caveats and limitations, which we could discuss in Q&A if you want to, about the data. But I like it better than the conventional sort of distance on an ideological scale between left and right. So in the theory of polarization that I have developed with Murat Somer and collaborators, mainly in these 2 edited volumes, we define pernicious polarization this way: a severe form of political polarization that is simplifying politics. And so we're dividing a society into 2 camps around a single line. They become mutually distrustful, and the normally cross-cutting differences that we see across those lines instead separate, and they get reinforced on a single us versus them dimension, dividing them. So at the political level, people do sort into like-minded groups, the center drops out, and people begin to view politics as a zero-sum game. You win means I must be losing. And adversaries move from being just competitors, such as in elections, to an enemy that needs to be eliminated. So we say when it gets to this level of being pernicious, that it also extends into the society, into social relations. Citizens divide spatially and socially. They get involved in stereotyping and prejudice, and this is the political psychology. Intergroup conflict dynamics come into play, and they begin to view the other as posing an existential threat to their way of life. Now, we also propose that polarization plays multiple roles when we consider the concept. So, very importantly, it's a strategy. It's a strategy used by political agents. So agency is very important. Political entrepreneurs use polarizing strategies to gain or retain power by creating these binary choices of us versus them. As they do that, they're kind of forcing society to label themselves. You have to go into one camp or another. And they can be doing this actually for democratic or even revolutionary transformative goals. They may be trying to transform society or democracy in some way. Or it can be for an authoritarian aim or for a personal aim, simply personal ambition, power, wealth. So it's a strategy, but it's also a process. And that's the process I first described in the definition. It's weakening cross-cutting ties and creating these 2 immovable blocks. This is the process of political polarization. And it's a condition when we reach an equilibrium of that high level, when we've moved far along this process, then we have the equilibrium of pernicious polarization. Now, our theory also, we propose that there's an endogenous nature to polarization. And that is that it is changing as it deepens. It is changing political actors themselves. It's changing incentives and creating pernicious incentives to engage in this in a tit for tat reciprocal manner, and it emboldens the extremes. And in this way, we see a chain reaction that leads to harm to democracy. So a political entrepreneur may start with polarizing strategies that is exploiting existing grievances or existing cleavages in a society, but they're exploiting them, putting them on the table, bringing them to the forefront, sometimes even inventing them, such as immigration crises. As they use these strategies of labeling us versus them, and they are the enemy, and demonizing and discrediting their opponents, it's creating this us versus them tribal logic, creating mutual distrust, dislike, and bias, and in that way, building this mutual perception of existential threat, which is then what allows citizens to say, wow, we have got to keep those guys out of power and keep our guys in power. And that's what leads to support for the violation of democratic norms. So quantitatively, what's the relationship with liberal democracy? You can just kind of see here with the VDEM data over time, this one's since 1975, and you can look at it going back further in time. But the blue line is liberal democracy as this is a world average. So as it increases, you can see that polarization tends to decrease. So what we see is a negative relationship between the health of democracy and polarization. As polarization decreases, democracy increases, and as polarization increases, we see a decline in democracy. So we looked at this statistically and did some tests. Now, this is correlation. This is not causation. It's complicated to show a causal story, but we did do lags out, testing it from 1 up to 5 years. And what we saw is that, yes, there's a strong relationship. Increased polarization does decrease the quality of liberal democracy. But interestingly, we didn't find any relationship with the rate. How fast does polarization occur? That doesn't seem to add on any explanatory power or any relationship. But we did with the level of polarization. So the level of polarization disproportionately decreases the quality of liberal democracy in the state. That was our hypothesis. Yes, severe, that is high levels of sustained polarization has the most negative effect. So it's adding on to this general effect. Okay, so what are the outcomes? Now, we also did, in my role at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm a non-resident scholar there as well. We've been doing some research looking at identifying episodes of polarization and depolarization. So in this one, we looked at the outcomes of pernicious polarization in democracy since 1950. So starting with all countries that identify as democracies, either electoral or liberal democracies, that reach this level of pernicious polarization, which on that scale of 0 to 4, we said anywhere between a 3 and a 4. So high levels. What happened to them? And what we see is, okay, that's the group of countries. What we found, all of those who depolarized, so they were up at that high level, they were able to bring it down. What happened to them in terms of what kind of regime they were categorized in by VDEM, which there are 4 options: liberal democracy, electoral democracy, electoral autocracy, and closed autocracy. Then what happened? And as you can see here, those who depolarized, again, they're starting out as democracies at either liberal or electoral. What happened? The ones who depolarized, they all stayed in their regime. Their regime category remained consistent. They were not downgraded. On the other hand, those who remained at pernicious levels of polarization tended, the majority, to be downgraded in their category. They were nearly 3/4 were downgraded, mostly to electoral autocracies. Now, most of these started at electoral democracies and downgraded to electoral autocracies. Now, I do want to point out this relationship between polarization and democracy is complex. As we know, some level of polarization that is simply distinguishing between political options is natural and healthy in a democracy, and political parties want to distinguish, show some difference and some distance for voters. But what we're talking about is when it gets to this extreme level, that's what we're calling pernicious. Now, also, for anyone who wants to create a major change, and it can be a positive change for social justice or democratization, we may need a disruptive polarizing strategy. We may intentionally want to follow a disruptive polarizing strategy to accomplish that. And we also recognize that polarization could be a cause or a consequence of democratic change. And it becomes complicated to show this statistically, but for example, if we see democratic collapse, there may have been high polarization and then there's a coup, or there is a more gradual democratic erosion. But if we move to autocracy, we may see that a country's polarization level declines because it is repressed, not because it is resolved. Okay, so we can see relationships going in different ways. Now, so the big question that everyone asks me, so how do we solve this? What do we do about it? I want to talk about it because it's very complex, and this is ongoing research, as I said, but some things we've already started to publish are here. I just wanted to point them out, that some of these are coming from this work I've done, particularly with Murat Somer. So at the Carnegie Endowment, this is one of the things that we're just finishing now. Before, we had looked at those polarizing episodes among democracies. Now we've looked at cases of depolarization among all countries from 1900 to 2020. And we had criteria for how to choose these episodes, but what we identified was 102 episodes of depolarization from pernicious levels. So they had to have been at pernicious levels and then depolarized for at least 5 years, from above 3 to below 3, and a certain amount on the scale, 10% of the scale, to show some substantive meaning there. So this is global, and it's all regimes, all types of regimes, democracies, autocracies. So we identified 102 episodes of this, and we were trying to see what were the contexts that were involved. And what we found is that 3/4 of them depolarized after some kind of systemic shock, which wouldn't necessarily be surprising. An independent struggle that might be very contentious, and then after the struggle is over, a country depolarizes. Democratic transitions toward democracy, going the other way, very few instances, but going toward democracy. So liberalizing and democratizing from some form of autocracy towards some form of democracy tended to result in a depolarization, and then ending a civil conflict. Of course, that's the least surprising one. Now, the ones we're really interested in, though, are these: the 1/4 of cases that are occurring within a regime. Now, I have to point out, there are no cases within liberal democracies. The US, as I said, was the only, in recent times, the only current advanced liberal democracy that has reached pernicious levels, but it has not depolarized. So we don't have good examples to learn from, to make recommendations for others. But most of our examples occur in electoral democracies and electoral autocracies. So our plan is to investigate what are the mechanisms, what are the strategies that they have used. And that's what we plan to do in a qualitative way over the next year. Now, but what we've looked at so far is we're really interested in the sustainability, because what we want to know is whatever they've done to address this polarization, is it sustainable? And then what happens to their is it enhancing democratic resilience or not? So what we found, I've summarized it here, but I'm going to show you on this next chart. Over here in this chart is that the sustained depolarization. So that means that they've come down, they had to be there 5 years to even count as one of our episodes. Now, what happened then? Did they repolarize? Did they sustain it for at least another decade? Or did they kind of manage it? It's still volatile, but going still under the pernicious level there of 3 to 4. So we saw that of the episodes, almost half were able to sustain it below pernicious levels for at least another decade. But there's another third who were managing this depolarization. So it was above 3, but then they brought it down and it's just close. It's like in the high 2s, or it could be volatile, or they brought it further down and it rises back up, but not quite above the threshold. Okay, so about a third of them did that. So they're managing it in some way. And then those who just couldn't, who just repolarized again within the first decade, 15%. So then we said, well, what about, because remember, this goes back to 1900, so we have some time except for the most recent ones. The most recent ones are these indeterminates. We haven't had a decade yet to see what happens. But we said, what happens in the very long term, beyond that initial decade? And here we found that only 11 democracies have sustained low depolarization to date from whenever they did. So Norway and Belgium, for example, after World War II, they've sustained it at very low levels. They've institutionalized all the way up till 2020. There's only 11 democracies that have done that. Half of if you combine the sustained and managed of these first two categories, half of them repolarized over this long term. That is repolarized above 3. We're talking about pernicious. And 16 countries had multiple cycles of this pernicious. So Bolivia, for example, goes up and down. Senegal has several. Okay, so that's just kind of a description of the state of the world. Now, why is it so hard then to overcome polarization? So I'm going to suggest 3 things. One is the incentives created by this logic of once we get into this equilibrium of pernicious polarization, lock the actors into place. There's a strong temptation for reciprocal, tit for tat polarization. So I start demonizing you as my opponent, and you will reciprocate. I am appealing to anger and resentment. You may reciprocate. I am carrying out anti-democratic behavior. You may reciprocate. There's also the perception among the public that it's a winner takes all. It's a very high stakes thing, particularly around elections. It can be a winner take all because remember, we're viewing each other as an existential threat. And so if I fear that if you come into power, if you win this election, you're going to threaten my democracy, or you and your policies are going to threaten me and my group, my way of life, threaten our nation, our national identity, then we're going to be locked into this strong polarization, refusing to work together. Now, also another problem is that we can't just rely on, if you get a polarizing incumbent and active, a leader who is beginning to erode democratic elements of your society or politicize, concentrate power, politicize institutions. You can't just rely on institutions of accountability, the courts, the media, even mechanisms like impeachment, because the institutions have become politicized. Either they have a leader has backslid so much that they have appointed loyalists, and so they've controlled the institutions, so they can't be impartial, or they may still be impartial, but they're distrusted by half of the population. So, for example, the impeachment of Donald Trump in the United States. The mechanism of impeachment cannot work as an accountability mechanism because half of the population views it as a political agenda of, in that case, the Democrats against Trump, that it was not a legitimate inquiry into presidential or executive overreach. And of course, and that's why it turned out to be a partisan, party line vote, as opposed to the impeachment of Richard Nixon, or the threat to impeach Richard Nixon was going to be bipartisan. And that's why he resigned. So the same with courts. So this is a problem. The further you get along into pernicious polarization, and if is that the institutions become perceived as politicized or actually politicized, and so they can't help you with it. They can't resolve the disputes. And then what tends to happen is over time, power balance may become asymmetrical. One side or another begins to win one way or another, and it becomes asymmetrical. So we have been working on theorizing some counterpolarization strategies, and particularly focusing on opposition actors. What can opposition actors do if there's a polarizing incumbent? So I'm going to just kind of show you our theoretical propositions and then end with a couple of examples from different types of cases. So the United States is a liberal democracy that is backsliding, but is still, as I said, considered a liberal democracy, flawed in some indexes like the Economist, but still up there. And then a polarized electoral autocracy, Hungary. What happens when you get that far? It's categorized now by, in the V-Dem regime, regimes of the world category, as electoral autocracy. So what Murat Somer and I have been theorizing is this. What can oppositions do in this case? What are the options? Well, first, it depends on their goals. So a preservative goal is if an opposition is trying to restore the status quo ante. And when we see that primarily is when there's been some new leader come in, bringing in some new sector of the population that was probably excluded in the past. I can give you an example of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, trying to bring in and be more inclusive of the poor who had felt, ignored and marginalized. Erdogan in Turkey, bringing in Muslims. So bringing them in, taking power, and the previous elite want to go back to the status quo ante. Okay, so that could be a preservative goal. A generative goal would be if the opposition is trying to be generative, particularly in thinking of a new social contract. So looking forward rather than looking backwards, as in the preservative goal. Okay, so the first thing is, what's the goal of this opposition? Then within those two goals, they have counterpolarization choices for their counterpolarization strategies. The first, a preservative goal, is we're going to look at the strategies are going to be more reactive. So the first is a reciprocal polarization. So along the same axis. So again, thinking about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, he's creative, he's confrontational. I mean, he's provoking the old elite, the opposition, but they are reacting. So there's a backlash to what he's trying to do and the changes he's trying to bring about. There's a backlash, but it's around the same axis. And they're simply saying no to Chavez, no to his supporters. And they're reciprocating, and they're using also extra constitutional means, coup attempts, strikes, massive protest, rebellion within the military. And so this kind of reciprocal polarization, demonization, discrediting him as well as he's discrediting his opposition. And that's going to deepen pernicious polarization. So the polarization outcome and then the expected democratic outcomes. Either you're going to have democratic dysfunction or paralysis, or you're going to have creeping authoritarianism under the incumbent, which happened in Venezuela, or you're going to have democratic collapse and the potential of the return of the old elite. So, for example, when Thailand had the coup in 2014, and previously, actually back in 2006, 2007, against Thaksin's first government, and then after his repeated efforts, it's a collapse and a return of the old elites. Now, you could have a passive depolarization, where you're simply failing to confront or change the axis of polarization. And what we mean by this might be an example of the German parties who basically appeased Hitler in the interwar period and thought they might be able to control him. And of course they couldn't. Or in Chile, a more positive example might be after the fall of Pinochet and the return to democracy, when there's basically, when the center left consciously chose to follow the same economic policy in order to try to keep stability and not threaten social or disruption, political disruption. And what they actually ended up doing was simply suspending elite polarization in particular. They were masking the polarization because they weren't addressing the underlying grievances that had given rise earlier in the Allende years to Pinochet's coup. And it erupted 20 years later. It took 20 years, but that's what we see now in the 2010s, massive social protests over the privatization of health and social security, inequality growing, because all of that was simply masked by that market consensus before. So that would be a case of weakened democratization. Now, on the generative side, we're proposing, and this first one is the hardest one to see, the hardest one to do, but a transformative repolarization, maybe around that can change the axis of polarization, but it's still like that disruptive one that I talked about, where it'd want to be a pro-democratic axis or pro-social justice axis is what you're creating. Democracy versus authoritarianism, justice versus injustice. And we expect that there could be reduced polarization as well if and when successful inclusive reforms are in place. So the trick there, if you're going to try to depolarize by essentially repolarizing, changing the nature of it, is to not use the demonizing language and to make sure you're focusing on values and ideas rather than identities. So we suspect that can slow or reverse autocratization. And then the other one that people try more often is this active depolarization, where you're trying to reestablish the cross-cutting ties. And you might contain polarization and hopefully you'll slow or reverse it. But this would be cases where oppositions try to unite. So the cases in the Hungarian mayoral elections, the Turkish mayoral elections, you're trying to unite and have a positive message and win that way. Or I think about this as the Joe Biden campaign in the United States. I'm going to govern on the behalf of everyone. I'm going to unite. I'm going to, lower the temperature kind of message. I think of the transformative as, in contrast, in the United States, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren effort, as an example. So the last two things I wanted to do is talk about these two cases. And what might be, because we have to look at particular challenges. Specific countries will have specific challenges, and then also kind of the state of where they are in the polarization and in the democratic status and how far it's eroded or backslid. So in this case, in the United States, I already showed you how exceptional it is among other liberal democracies. And the question is why? Why is it that way? And why is it sustained? And I think it's for several factors here. The first are the institutional factors, which is the extreme majoritarian electoral system, gives very high stakes winner take all elections. It does more, it allows for gerrymandering, it's our campaign finance system, but because we are one of only five out of 26 major liberal democracies have single member district elections. And 2 of those have some alternative. Australia has basically ranked choice voting within it as well, which is like instant runoff, and France has runoffs. So the only 3 that are completely single member district are Canada, UK, and the United States. Now, those other 2 aren't so bad off as the United States. So you have to look at the additional things. I said campaign finance, our free speech, kind of extreme, unregulated, but also these counter-majoritarian institutions. So in the US, we have extremely disproportionate representation in the Senate, and that translates also into the Electoral College, which right now, because of our partisan sorting over the last 3 decades, is empowering the minority party. It's empowering the party with the strength in the rural areas where we have disproportionate representation. And that party now is the Republican Party. And it's empowering them to basically rely on turning out their base rather than trying to expand their electorate or the attraction. So I am a big proponent of electoral reform to increase choice and representation as a way to address this. Also, the US is polarized around what I call a formative rift, which is around an unresolved historic debate at the country's founding around citizenship and national identity. In the case of the United States, this formative rift is around race and religion in particular. And every time that formative rift arises again, we see polarization increasing. Whenever we make progress on it, such as advancing rights of Black Americans, first ending slavery and the civil rights movement, we've always seen a backlash. So 1 step forward, 2 steps back. That becomes very polarizing. We're seeing it again right now. We're seeing it again today. So the solution, the yellow is the solution, confront the rift head on, and we have to re-envision a multiracial and multicultural democracy for the United States. I'm not a specialist on technology, but media, social media, the model that it's using is, I do believe, a big contributor to polarization. And that is the AI, the algorithmic model, and the business model, the way profit is made here, is privileging outrage politics and contributing. So I think we have to address that. And then finally, we have to recognize one party, the Republican Party, is adopting authoritarian behaviors and tolerating political violence. They're focusing on party power over democracy, democratic principles and norms. And I think that the solution to that is that elected officials, cultural influencers related to them must distance themselves from and denounce the violent actors who say they're operating in their name, and actually elected members of Congress who are carrying out these policies. They have to be denounced. They have to be distanced from. All right, and then finally, the example of Hungary as an example of what are the challenges in an electoral autocracy. Well, here we think that looking at the current state of being, incremental autocratization leads to particular dilemmas here. Regime uncertainty. There's uncertainty about the very nature of the regime. Because of the incremental nature of current day democratic erosion or backsliding, there's no clear breakdown. You don't have necessarily a specific date when you can say democracy broke down. It's not like the coups that are clear. Even when you get to electoral autocracy, there are continued elections. And so there's a debate within the electorate about whether it's still a democracy, and particularly whether to participate. And then polarizing politics, actors on both sides can be using polarizing strategies that are actually undermining democracy while they say they're defending democracy. So all of this is producing these coordination and collective action dilemmas for the oppositions. And so one of the things they need to figure out, okay, if we're going to be in the opposition, do we target a specific policy, a specific democratic norm violation, a specific act of corruption? Or do we target the entire regime legitimacy and say the whole regime is corrupt, the whole regime's authoritarian? They also have a dilemma and often divide over whether to even participate in politics and in elections. And I see this in Venezuela a lot all the time. If we participate in this election that's clearly manipulated, aren't we just legitimizing the regime and the process? And how can we denounce it afterwards? That's a question. It's a very good question. But if we boycott, as they've also tried in Venezuela, you completely lose your voice. You're making no progress. I do not advocate for boycotts. But oppositions divide over. This is a dilemma for them. And then finally, we see all the time, and I think, in Hungary, we've witnessed this challenge this year as they're trying to divide up the slots on the party lists. Do you pursue the collective interest? Do you figure out some mechanism to choose those, whether it's a primary or public opinion polls or whatever? Or is each party just fighting as much as they can for the private interest of their party to make sure their party can be number one? So there's all these dilemmas. So what are constructive opposition strategies? Well, in this kind of a case, in fighting an electoral autocracy, uniting is the obvious one. That's a prerequisite. But that's easier for a campaign, much harder for governing. If you win, much harder to stay together. Second, you need to campaign for something, not just against the incumbent. There's got to be a positive proposal. What are you proposing? Third, you need to address the grievances, perhaps admit mistakes when, if you were in power before, maybe there was some mistake of unresponsiveness. And then propose and implement inclusive policies, including the supporters of your opponents. Now, there is a caveat, and we see this in the United States right now. Even very popular policies that people like across the board can be discredited, delegitimated by your opponents. Fourth, use institutional rather than extra institutional mechanisms for accountability. Laura Gamboa has some good research on this. As I said before, caveat there is once they're politicized, you kind of lose this mechanism for accountability, though. This is a problem, particularly in electoral autocracies. And finally, debating ideas rather than identities. So maybe focusing on the Constitution, some shared values. Democracy, the nation, or social justice. So that's what I wanted to present. I want to thank you. I want to recognize my co-authors, and I would be pleased to receive comments or questions.
Thank you.